story. Philip's fifth-grade class was in the midst of studying the human body. He had worked hard to pay attention to the discussions on diet, exercise, and the many ways we can take care of our body. That same week, his parents took him to the movies. They arrived at the theater only to discover a long line of people waiting for tickets. Excited, Philip took the opportunity to demonstrate his newfound knowledge. Pacing up and down the line, he pointed at each person and announced in a loud voice, "That's a fat man. There's a skinny man. That woman's very short. That man is obese, and he might die soon." By the time Philip's parents shared this story, they recounted his obliviousness with amusement. But they weren't laughing when it happened. Then there was Eli, a teenager who had just entered high school and was struggling to learn how to engage in conversations. Like many people with autism, he had a tendency to speak in detail about the topics he cared about, but he rarely bothered to ask others what they were interested in. I made some suggestions about asking questions and listening to clues about what the other person might want to discuss, but I could see from his facial expressions that he was feeling increasingly frustrated. "Other people can do that," Eli finally said, "but it's not easy for me." "Why not?" I asked. "Well," he said, "other people can read each other's minds." That was how Eli made sense of the social world, where he was extremely aware that friends and strangers were interacting in all kinds of ways he could not comprehend. The only way he could explain how easy it seemed to them was to assume that neurotypical people must be imbued with telepathy, a power he lacked. What else could account for his struggles? In a sense, those two experiences, Philip in the movie line, Eli's assumption about mind reading, illustrate two extremes of how people with autism relate to the social world, with its hidden rules, unspoken expectations, and often nuanced use of language. Nearly every person with autism has some degree of difficulty navigating the social world. Some, like Philip, are so oblivious to social convention that they aren't aware of their own blunders and pay little attention to how others perceive their actions. Others, like Eli, struggle in a different way. They are all too cognizant that social rules and expectations exist, but since they don't intuitively understand them, they often feel anxious, and their self-esteem suffers as they struggle to negotiate a world that seems to defy their grasp. The challenge of learning social rules. For both groups, those who are blissfully unaware and those who worry excessively, the challenge is rooted in the same issues. Human beings are hardwired to be socially intuitive, but autism poses challenges to developing that intuition. Consider the organic way we learn language. A mother doesn't sit her toddler down and explain the parts of speech or how to conjugate a verb. We learn by being exposed to language and immersed in it. We listen and observe in order to construct our own knowledge of language. In the jargon of language development research, we induce the rules of language, and as a result, we learn the meanings of words and how to use them to express complex ideas. The same is true of social rules. Typically, people induce the often subtle, invisible conventions of social interaction. They learn by a process of immersion and osmosis, along with periodic coaching. Please do not interrupt while mommy's talking to grandpa. But for people with autism, the nature of their disability makes it very difficult to survey the social landscape and induce those rules. They can learn them, but it's like learning a second language as an adult, when it's much harder to achieve the same fluency and comfort as native speakers. What comes naturally and effortlessly to others always requires some degree of conscious effort, and one is constantly reminded of the struggle. I first met Philip when I was doing a home consultation for his 4-year-old son with autism. Philip was a successful investment banker in his 40s and was diagnosed as an adult with Asperger's syndrome. He had graduated with honors from a prestigious MBA program, but he told me that was nothing compared to grappling with the social world. Learning economics and finance was like breathing air to me, he said. But to this day, I have to read books to help me understand people, their facial expressions and social nuance and innuendo. Imagine walking into an unfamiliar cafeteria for the first time. There are different types of cafeterias. In some, customers pay a cashier first, then pick up a tray and select food from various stations. In others, you choose the foods you'll eat, put them on your tray, and then pay at the end of the line. Where does one pick up the cutlery, the condiments, the beverages? It's different at every cafeteria. When you enter a cafeteria for the first time, how do you learn the rules? You watch people. You discover the unwritten rules of the cafeteria by observing how other customers make their way through the line, how they act, what they get where. If you had autism, though, you probably wouldn't instinctively watch people in that situation. You might just head directly to get the food you want, possibly by cutting the line, as getting food is your goal after all. As a person with autism, you might have some awareness that rules need to be followed, but because you don't know what they are, you might feel disoriented and lost, or you might look around for clues, bewildered. And it's unlikely that your impulse would be to learn by observing other people's behavior. That's how the social world can feel to a person with autism. Like an unfamiliar cafeteria, with rules that all the other diners apparently already know, but that seem nearly impossible to learn. Of course, people with autism can learn the rules, with support. Another cafeteria analogy is helpful. On a visit to Denver, I once dined in a salad bar restaurant with its own unique arrangement. When customers entered, they were immediately directed to the salad bar. Then they paid a cashier. Next came another area for soup, sandwiches, and desserts, all included in the fixed price. How was a newcomer to understand the proper sequence of steps? Someone had considered that question and developed visual supports to teach the rules, probably after bewildered customers were confused about how to proceed. The restaurant posted signs with visual diagrams breaking down the process for novices. Start with the salad line, then pay, then help yourself to soup and dessert. It was as if every customer had autism, and the restaurant was accommodating us by providing a sequence of steps so we could understand. In the real social world, people with autism are usually left to fend for themselves, navigating a reality that seems to make sense to everyone but themselves. It's no wonder Roz Blackburn is fond of offering a candid statement. That's why I don't do social. Another young adult with autism, Justin Kanha, see Chapter 10, offered his own charmingly blunt assessment. Told by a friend, also on the autism spectrum, that he needed to practice his manners, Justin smiled and replied, "Manners suck." Another social factor we consider, usually without deliberately thinking about it, is the cultural context in which we find ourselves. When I travel internationally, I am reminded of how many of the rules governing social interactions are specific to our own society. On a trip to mainland China, I paid a visit to a large, crowded retail store in Guangzhou to get a feel for the local culture. I was waiting in line at the cashier when a woman behind me abruptly pushed me, apparently to join someone in front of me in line. As she passed, without warning, she grabbed my shoulder and roughly shoved me aside, never pausing to excuse herself or apologize. If someone had done that to me in my local Target, it would have been grounds for confronting her. But I had learned that in China, where large crowds are common, such behavior is normal. I was able to put it in context and, shaken as I was, react appropriately, which is to say, not at all. Difficulty reading social situations. When people with autism display behavior that appears to be abrupt or rude, or when they simply seem oblivious, it is often because their neurological wiring makes it difficult to weigh the many subliminal factors that help us read social situations. This lack of innate understanding manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Michael's family occasionally held Sunday barbecues for the 12-year-old child's team, the professionals and teachers who worked with their son. In the midst of these gatherings, Michael would sometimes begin giggling to himself, sitting at the table but clearly occupied by his own thoughts. Even after one of his parents asked him to stop, he would continue. When it happened while I was visiting, I seized the opportunity to gain some insight into his behavior. "Michael," I said, "could you explain what's making you feel funny?" He pointed at one of the therapists across the table. "It's Susie," he said. "She has such a high, squeaky voice. It makes my body feel funny." The young woman blushed, embarrassed. "Well, I guess I'm going to have to adjust my voice to a lower register during our sessions," she told him. Michael was unaware that he had caused embarrassment. He was answering my question with an objective fact. She did have a high, squeaky voice. He didn't understand the social rule that it's best not to say anything about a person in public if it's not positive. How would any child learn that? A parent would likely provide some coaching for a younger child, but by age 12, most children would have had multiple experiences in surveying the social landscape, a process that leads to a fuller understanding of the unspoken rules of politeness. Luke was another child whose social challenges showed up early, when his kindergarten teacher complained that he didn't know how to play with other children. Instead of playing the way other children played in his inclusive class, Luke would grab other kids and try to tackle them. Luke was a sweet child who had never been aggressive, and he was generally a happy youngster. In fact, he flashed a broad smile when dragging kids to the ground, so it wasn't immediately clear why he was being so physical. When, in my capacity as consultant for his school district, I met with his parents and the team of educators who worked with Luke, his mother offered an explanation. Luke had 2 older brothers, and their play at home tended to be physical. Lots of jumping on each other and tackling. So at 4 and a half, Luke had taken that concept of play to school. He wasn't able to discern from the children's body language or facial expressions that they weren't enjoying his physical play. Nor did he intuitively understand that different rules applied at home and at school. The limitations of teaching social rules. Schools are full of explicit rules,